Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IEA's 8th webinar of 2026. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, I very warmly welcome you to our discussion this morning, where we'll be looking at Kenya's Financial Action Task Force's ratings, that's the FATF, and the economic policy implications of illicit financial flows. For purposes of today's presentation, we'll have a presentation that will be done by three speakers. So Leo Kemboi, who is my colleague at the IEA and working together with me in the Law and Economy program, myself, and Mr. Kwame Owino, who is the Chief Executive of the IEA. So I'll talk about the outline shortly, but just for a brief background regarding the Institute of Economic Affairs. So the IEA is a public policy think tank, and our mission is to inform decision-making in Kenya through conducting evidence-based research and making proposals for innovative policy proposals, basically to advance evidence-based policy formulation. That's the background to what we do, and we work across 6 program areas, beginning with public finance management, constitution, law, and the economy, that is hosting this meeting today together with the Popular Economics program. We have a program on economic regulation and competition policy, international trade, and futures and foresight. So that's our main policy areas of work. So we are very glad that you're able to join us for our discussion today. And we'll invite you in the course of our discussion. If you have any questions, please list them in the dialog box on this platform, and we will allow an engaging Q&A during plenary session, the plenary session. So note down any questions, concerns you have. We'll also allow you to speak later and basically contribute to the discussion. So that's the background. We go to the main content of our presentation today, and in terms of an outline, so we'll begin with looking at the policy rationale for anti-money laundering and terrorism financing, and then we'll go to the unmet, we'll look at the findings basically of the most recent FATF reports, and share a summary of our assessments of those findings, highlight the unmet criteria Kenya's unmet criteria in the reports, and then the partially met criteria as well as the unmet criteria, look at the overall performance, and then share our thoughts in terms of the economic analysis of what those reports mean for Kenya, and then we'll come to conclusions. So that's it for the outline of our presentation. So I'll begin with the first part, which is basically the policy rationale. But before I actually go into the main content, to avoid making assumptions that we are all on the same page in terms of what the different technical terms mean, I'll just provide some basic definitions. We all know what IFFs mean because you'll hear this mentioned throughout the presentation. So that's illicit financial flows. And what we mean is basically all funds that are earned, transferred, or used illegally. And this includes money that is obtained from various illicit channels. It could be corruption, tax evasion, organized crime, terrorism financing, and other unlawful activities. And the problem with such funds is basically circulating freely is that they invariably weaken Kenya's public finance system. They invariably distort markets and shift the burden of funding from the taxpayers that are compliant. Onto the taxpayers that are compliant from the other non-compliant citizens. So in a very brief summary, that's it for on IFFs. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is the Financial Action Task Force. You might all know, but I'd not like to make the assumption, but this is commonly referred to as the FATF, and it's basically the international body that assesses how well different countries prevent the risks associated with the circulation of IFFs as I have defined. So it does not necessarily investigate crimes directly, but just provides an assessment or evaluation of whether countries have systems, laws, policies, and institutions that make it difficult for criminals to use the financial system, and whether those systems work in practice. So the availability of systems and laws to cap IFFs, as well as the efficiency of the performance of those institutions. So the FATF reports that we'll be discussing today basically, they ask two basic questions from our assessment. So first, do the right laws and institutions exist for capping IFFs? And then second, do those laws actually work to detect crime, to stop the illicit financial flows, and to recover stolen assets? So the ratings that we'll be sharing with you are summary or aggregation of that background. Yes, I thought I'd explain that before I now go to the actual policy rationale. So in terms of the policy rationale, or the policy background for Kenya's anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism legal framework, what exists on paper. We have a number of laws, but most prominently, we have the Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2009, which provides the basic framework for detecting and prosecuting money laundering. Then we have the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which establishes the mechanisms for addressing terrorism financing. And then more recently, we have the Anti-Money Laundering and Combating of Terrorism Financing Laws Amendment Act, which basically strengthen the supervisory powers, sanctions, and coordination of the relevant bodies. So that in terms of our constitutional framework on management of public finances, in addition to all the laws regulating the performance of the finance institutions and the banking sector. So we have a robust legal infrastructure. And it's important to establish this at the onset, because then it rules out the common explanation for why Kenya receives weak ratings, as being an absence of regulatory framework. So weak ratings under the FATF are not necessarily a function of the absence of laws, but as we'll see, it's the problem comes in with the effectiveness of that. So we move to the next slide. So having looked at that background, we asked ourselves, so why the FATF ratings is an important policy question. So, and I've already alluded to this briefly, but the Financial Action Task Force basically evaluates countries along technical compliance. So asking whether laws and institutions exist, as I'd mentioned, and then secondly, the effectiveness of these institutions. So asking whether those laws actually work in practice. So while lawyers are usually concerned with rules-based order and strict adherence to rules, for instance, we all know that the economists will tell you that markets care more about the effectiveness of those rules rather than the mere availability of the statutes. So to give an example, we know that international banks and investors do not price risk based on how many laws are on the books. They essentially price risks based on the how on their perception of the on enforcement outcomes. So where we have states having low scores or low effectiveness ratings, this creates a perception of regulatory arbitrage. And what we mean here in this context, it's basically a perception that criminals or illicit actors could exploit the weaknesses in the country's enforcement system to move or hide money in these countries because it's easier or less risky to do so. There's basically less incentive to comply, and it seems easier for them because they know they are likely, the reward is high, they're likely to get away with it in these jurisdictions. So consequently, that perception drives de-risking and raises the compliance premiums, which ultimately increases the cost of capital by different financing institutions. So in short, to say that the financial action task force's outcomes basically fit directly into the economic considerations that lead or economic variables that matter for growth, for international trade, for financial stability, and so on. So that is why in our assessment, the FATF rating for Kenya as a country and just all states consider it important for policy for those reasons. Move to the next slide. So we took some time to analyze the most recent reports, and as well as a number of reports in addition to the Financial Action Task Force's reports. But from our quick summary, the content analysis of the 2022 mutual evaluation report, and then the subsequent action points throughout the reports that have issued last year and the years before, we summarized it as such. So in plain terms, we looked at how often certain themes or categories or just plain terms appear in the report. So the number of times each category appears simply shows where the report is like spending more attention. So in simple, we see that, as you can see here, the terms remains met appeared 25 times, considered met 79 times, partly met 19 times, not met 21 times. We'll break that down, but that's just a quick summary of the content. So we move to now the summary across the 11 immediate outcomes. So the way the report is structured, there are certain areas that summarize performance across different categories. And so you will see here the immediate outcome number, what it means, what's rather the title of that outcome, the rating by the FATF rating, the core findings from the reports, and then our legal and economic interpretation of what those ratings and what the findings mean. So even before I go into the individual lines, you can see, excuse me, a first view of it, you'll see that Kenya performs better on the outcomes that are related to risk assessment, the availability of policies and institutional setup. That's why it's moderate, not great performance, but moderate. But then the performance weakens, as I will show you as we move into supervision, investigation, prosecution, and confiscation, basically the actual effectiveness of those laws and policies. So this slide summarizes the performance, Kenya's performance across these 11 immediate outcomes that the FATF uses to, or FATF uses to assess effectiveness. So I'll very quickly go into each one of them, like just summarizing what we found. So under outcome one, which we summarized as risk policy and coordination, you can see that this basically assesses whether the country understands its money laundering and terrorism financing risks, and whether the different agencies coordinate effectively to prevent this. So the rating here was low, and usually where countries are rated low, it means that risk assessments may exist on paper, but the coordination is significantly weak, and or if there are any strategies to preventive strategies, then these are not fully implemented. So on this, the core finding was that the National Anti-Money Laundering and CFT countering financing of terrorism coordination is fragmented, and the risk assessments are not consistently operationalized across agencies. So our interpretation is or the actual legal and economic interpretation is that if the risks are not properly understood or coordinated across these agencies, then the enforcement is fragmented and inefficient, which raises the regulatory arbitrage risk. And I mentioned the consequence of that earlier. Then the second outcome, which is on international cooperation, this basically measures how well Kenya cooperates with other countries in strengthening or sharing intelligence and evidence. And typically, if a rating is low, it's for any country, it basically shows that requests for information sharing could be responded to slowly. There's likely to be inconsistent feedback. And Kenya's actual findings, as you can see here, was that this mutual legal assistance exists, but the operational cooperation and case outcomes, positive case outcomes are limited. And the interpretation we give to this is that this likely increases the cross-border risk perception and may discourage foreign financial institutions making certain investments. Then 3, on supervision. So this assesses whether regulators supervise financial institutions and the designated non-financial businesses and professions, whether they are sufficiently supervised, or whether they're using a risk-based approach. So where the findings are low, then it means that supervision may exist, but this is not consistently risk-based. And in our case here, it was low indeed. So which means that the risk-based supervision is uneven, and the non-financial businesses, designated non-financial businesses and professions are insufficiently supervised. And the interpretation here we gave was that while the powers may exist in law, those supervisory powers may exist in law, then obviously the practical implementation has been uneven, and non-bank sectors remain major anti-money laundering vulnerability pathways. Then on the fourth outcome, which is on preventive measures. So again, this looks at whether banks and other reporting institutions properly conduct customer due diligence and identify beneficial owners and so on. And so where there are weaknesses, this would typically signal that due diligence may not be consistently applied, or suspicious transaction reports may may not be of the proper quality. So in this instance, the rating, the FATF rating was moderate. And specifically, the finding was that banks demonstrate stronger AML and CFT frameworks, meaning, again, as I mentioned earlier, that the availability of those frameworks is there, but there are gaps in the quality of the reporting. So the suspicious transaction reports quality and the DNFBP compliance. Then the interpretation we give for that is that the weak preventive controls increase the probability of the illicit money entering or moving through the system. Then the fifth area is on legal persons and beneficial ownership, which obviously assesses the transparency of company ownership. So here it was also the rating was moderate as well. So, and where rated low or moderate, it shows that authorities, the regulating authorities cannot easily identify who truly owns companies. So as I mentioned again, in terms of the law, we now have a bio beneficial ownership framework. And so what the finding here is insinuating is that the beneficial ownership framework has improved legally, but the verification of using this framework or the verification of company ownership and sanctions is application of sanctions is still limited. So the rating here was moderate because of the availability of the sanctions, but the utility is another question. And the implication or our interpretation was that the transparency architecture exists, but the enforcement credibility is incomplete or remains incomplete, which means that shell companies, for instance, can conceal proceeds of crime. Then the sixth area on summarized as financial intelligence measures whether the Financial Reporting Center collects, analyzes, and disseminates intelligence effectively. The score here was low, again, in terms of the effectiveness of the institutions that we spoke about, low. So this measures whether the FRC collects, analyzes, and disseminates intelligence effectively. Kenya's findings here was that the Financial Reporting Center produces intelligence, but there's limited translation into investigations and prosecutions. So the intelligence to enforcement pipeline is running or binding constraint in our interpretation. Then the seventh area on money laundering investigation and prosecution, again, a low score. So this looks at whether the money laundering cases are actually investigated and prosecuted. For a low score like we had, it implies that standalone money laundering cases are rare or few. And Kenya's finding was that there are few complex money laundering prosecutions relative to its risk exposure. So again, our interpretation, the law exists, but the enforcement outcomes is limited, which implies that the deterrence is weak and subsequently illicit financial flows retain high expected payoffs. Then eighth, under confiscation, which basically measures that the outcome measures whether proceeds of crime are traced and recovered. And you can see that the rating was low again, which implies that the asset recovery is not systematic and confiscation the government may not be pursuing confiscation as a policy objective. So Kenya's finding here was that asset recovery is not proportionate to Kenya's risk profile. So the confiscation outcomes are limited. Our interpretation of this is that without confiscation, the AML, the laws, the framework lose their economic deterrence power because if the persons who are contributing to the movement of illicit financial flows can keep those gains, then it means that effectively the deterrence is very limited. Then 9, under terrorism, the outcome under terrorism financing investigation, again ranked low. So this assesses the investigations, the effectiveness of investigations and prosecutions. And so the low ranking signals that there are significant vulnerabilities within the national security. So the core finding here was that the legal tools exist, but the operational results and investigations remain limited. And then finally, on the 10th and 11th outcomes, which are on terrorism financing preventive measures and the financial sanctions and proliferation financing sanctions. So this assess whether the international sanctions related to terrorism and proliferation are implemented within the country effectively. And so both of these had low scores, which mean that the sanctions are not applied properly and the monitoring mechanisms are incomplete. So coming back to what I started with in interpreting this table, you can see that the pattern here shows that Kenya performs better when required to enact a law for compliance with the whatever requirement global if for whatever requirement there is for Kenya to actually enact the laws, then we tend to do a little better on that. But when it comes to enforcement or operationalization of those laws and having institutions that work fully, then we see the problem. So yeah, I will not belabor that. Then we move to the next slide. So in terms of the unmet criteria, moving more specifically to some technical gaps that we observed. So under criteria 16.4, we see that there is no requirement for reporting institutions to verify the information pertaining to its customer where there is suspicious money laundering or terrorism financing acts, or where there's suspicion of the happening of those. So, so this means that if a bank, for instance, suspects money laundering or terrorism financing, it is not explicitly required to re-verify the customer's information at that point of suspicion. So the plain meaning of this was that the moment when risks become highest, it does not necessarily trigger stronger verification obligations, which is a problem. Yes, which is a problem. And then the other unmet criteria is basically 26.5, which where basically shows that supervisory authorities now in Kenya have the extensive powers and the Proceeds of Crime and Anti-Money Laundering Act, but then the reviewers could not determine whether supervision is truly risk-based. And what does this mean? That the regulators, yes, can conduct inspections, but it was unclear during the time of this review whether the inspection frequency and the intensity are actually aligned with the risk profiles. Then, yes, so, and of course, the economic implication of this is that if the supervision is not aligned or calibrated to risk, then the enforcement resources are misallocated. We move to the next slide. Yeah, so the other unmet criteria that we thought we'd focus on is 26.6. So the authorities stated that they conduct risk assessments of financial institutions. However, those risk assessments were not shared with the reviewers. So there was no evidence that they are done periodically. And there was also no evidence that they respond to the major changes in institutions. And the plain meaning of this is that while the risk assessments actually exist, there is no proof that they are updated or effective or properly operationally integrated. Then under the last one that I will talk about, which was criteria 40.4, which was rated as not met. So basically this states that Kenya has not demonstrated that it provides timely feedback to foreign authorities after receiving assistance. So, but though there is no legal prohibition on providing feedback, there was no evidence of clear timelines, no formal procedures, no structured feedback mechanisms. And so the plain interpretation for this again is that international cooperation may happen, but then it lacks the proper institutionalized follow through. And so, yes, as we know, you know that trust between jurisdictions depends on reciprocity. So where the feedback loops are weak, it basically implies that it can influence negative global risks perception. So I'll end my part of the presentation at this and allow Leo to come in and discuss the economic analysis, after which he will invite Kwame to make the conclusions. Leo.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And just my role now is to focus on the economic analysis part. What does this mean for economic policy? So we'll discuss the first question is that the big policy imperative now for Kenya is to get off the FATF grey list. And we need to understand how Kenya got into that list. As Jackie showed you, there are those immediate outcomes, the 11 outcomes. When a country is effectiveness rating is low in those 11, majority of those 11 outcomes, it immediately goes into a grey list. And so Kenya's case in here would be to try and get to majority of those raise effectiveness rating in the majority of those 11 outcomes. And we are going to discuss subsequently that. So ordinarily, we looked at the average number of years. It's between 1 to 3 years to address those deficiencies and get off the increased monitoring, the grey list. The second issue is that it requires the list it requires an implementation of a customized action plan, and that's why we looked at the 11 outcomes. The rating and the re-rating along those 11 outcomes is on the basis of the agreed reform. And then the most important part, and I think if we all forget everything that I say today, the most important part is that exiting that list requires an on-site assessment to verify that the reforms are effective and not just adopted. So it's not a question of it's the effectiveness. So you might have a beneficial ownership law, but it requires the effectiveness of that law. So they have to test, for example, whether you are doing verifications, and secondly, whether that jurisdiction is also providing sanctions for violations. So there are when we looked at the report and when we looked at the commentary around the report, one of the things that we saw is that the main focus is on beneficial ownership or laws, sanction or laws, or sector-specific questions. So in Kenya, particularly the lawyers, real estate, construction, the real estate, basically the construction, and others, including government suppliers, have been designated as those specific. So the focus is on those specific areas. But we want to where our economics at, and when we'll be making reference to a law and economics approach, that to deal with the problem, it's an enforcement production function, and that function requires that you are able to convert that intelligence, the suspicious transaction reports, into prosecutions and confiscations. If that is not happening, that is where the real bottleneck is. That's where the real problem is. So what this means for policy is that Kenya has improved the inputs part, which is how do you generate suspicious transaction reports? Secondly, how the laws, whether the availability of laws, the preventive measures, what specific sanctions should exist, all those things that cover has already been produced. Where the problem is the outputs now. You need to see those cases being investigated, prosecuted, and finally confiscations take place. And remember, I just want to remind people, the mutual evaluation report that was done in 2022 even had number of cases. even had a specific analysis around those cases that had been raised. So if the way we have explained, we are going to explain so if we take an institutional production function and we organize the 11 outcomes around 5 buckets. The first bucket, which is the legal framework, which is the statutes, regulations, and formal mandates. So this is practice directions issued by regulatory agencies. Remember, in this case, regulatory agencies like IRA, the Insurance Regulatory Authority, the Central Bank of Kenya, among others, would play a major role. Financial Reporting Center, the law enforcement agencies created by the Constitution. The second bucket is the issue of supervision, which is now that risk-based oversight, that supervisory intensity. How regularly is a regulator, for example, like the central bank, looking at banks and taking action? The third is a question of financial intelligence, that suspicious transaction report quality, FRC analytics, dissemination. This is an important part because as regular users of the bank, of banking services, we've seen this. You have paid school fees for the last 10 years, but suddenly the bank is asking you for why are you the source of paying that? But it's not, it's the quality of that suspicious transaction report, which is an important element. Prosecution, how you're able to turn around those into now investigations and convictions, deal with case complexity, get around case complexity, and then confiscation. So if you look at the legal framework, Kenya's rating around technical compliance has been rated as improved, and an high effectiveness rate. The other four buckets, which is the supervision, intelligence, prosecution, and confiscation, is now what has remained as low. So that's where the problem is. And we all know from economics that the marginal increase, if you increase the margin, if you increase the marginal increase in now the legal framework, does not generate returns, cannot generate returns without necessarily a corresponding increase in supervision, investigation, in supervision, intelligence, prosecution, and confiscation. So, and in this stage, the elasticity of anti-money laundering effectiveness with respect to enforcement strategy is close to zero, and that's what we see. So we also see from that the volume in terms of suspicious transaction volumes, transition reports, they are high on the basis of our reading of the FATF reports. The problem is that low conversion into investigations. So, and that creates a weak feedback loop between the law enforcement and the financial reporting center. Another thing is the question about prosecution. There is a low number of complex money laundering prosecutions relative to risk exposure. So if you look at the complexity of cases that are already reported, you see less of those prosecutions around those complex money laundering cases. And then the most important thing that we also need to mention is that the genesis of this AML is, and the money laundering is the source, is that the predicate crimes dominate. So it's rarely to find standalone money laundering cases. So it's a law enforcement problem. And let me give an example. given an NYS example. So you have a government agency that suddenly gets a lot of money. The budget grows goes up by almost 10 times. So there's a lot to expend. So they violate procurement laws, Kenyan procurement laws. They violate other laws like company laws because there were some fictitious firms. Then they come violate the banking law. Then so it's a case where you just see before the money laundering issue comes into play, there are almost like another 10 statutes that are Kenyan statutes that have been violated. So before that, so it's very rare to see money laundering cases on their own. So you see predicate, so that's why we say predicate crimes dominate. So that's our reading. Then the third question is a question about confiscation. So the major rating, the FATF rating, the ISMART rating style is that they look at risk exposure, and then they look at how fast are you doing how are you doing recovery. So if it's not corresponding, so you recovered 3% or 5%, so that asset recovery confiscation, the effectiveness rating will be low. So all these failures have led to now that collapsed deterrence. So on the enforcement side. Now, just to where a policy wonk at, and to give a perspective, the nature of deterrence is it requires that the probability of detection and punishment has to be very high, and then the expected financial penalty, which includes confiscation, not just the prosecution stage, but also includes confiscation, has to be high. When the two of them are high, it will be greater than the expected gain. Then you've established deterrence. So Kenyan law enforcement agencies, and this is the question, will provide how to track outcomes, and Kwame will speak about the political economy questions. But the major reasoning from the way we understand how crime occurs, how the institutions operate, and all these things, is deterrence can only be established if that probability of detection and punishment is high, and the expected financial penalty. So you've created, by doing that, you then create a disincentive. And now you require, then firms, the general economy on its own would organize, because firms, for example, would require that certain persons or people they associate with do not play in this game of money laundering. So then this is the clarion call for Kenyan law enforcement and generally the regulatory institutions, that if you want to tip, and especially in this case, the National Treasury, if you want to tip the tide, the first, and especially given the fact that FATF rating now is keen on Kenya's enforcing these laws, you have to provide a deterrence level that is able to create that disincentive. So what we read from the FATF profile, especially the 2025 report, is that the probability of detection and punishment is low, so weak investigations and prosecutions, and then the expected final penalty is low. In fact, we were just looking and trying to find which is the single largest case of expected reported case of a money laundering case, and then trying to look again at which is the single largest asset recovery that has been done. And so we couldn't find it. The highest that we could find is going back as chicken gate scandal. If you all, for those who remember the IBC, for the IIEC. So, but here we don't look, and this was across the jurisdiction in the UK. But the local here, we just perhaps that the single largest could be the case of the governor or the bank's settlement with the with the DPP on NYS. So for that, illicit financial activity remains rational behavior, and this is solid economic reasoning. You can't, unless you create that disincentive, you'll not be able to provide a deterrent. So another thing is, so how to track outcomes, and this is for people who are interested, including regulators. So there has to be the genesis is the suspicious transaction reports. The quality has to be high, and meaning that it will force agencies to now create a specific rubric that is risk-based to be able to convert those suspicious transaction reports to investigations. So to investigations. Then the second question is prosecution yield, which is of all those investigations that have been done, how many of them lead to convictions? And then the confiscation efficiency is the assets confiscated has to be has to correspond to exposure risk. So you can, for example, say that 730 billion shillings are lost, for example, through procurement fraud. And then that confiscation efficiency is, say, 500 million shillings or 2 billion shillings. So that 2 billion out of 730. So that there has to be corresponding. And then supervisory coverage. And so you see the inspections as a share of risk exposure. So it means that not even just designated parties that persons who have been designated, but just looking at the entire economy as it is and raising that efficiency. So you can't have 1 million transaction reports and then say 5 prosecutions. And then out of those 5 prosecutions, 2 convictions. So that in itself is the reason why Kenya ended up on the gray listing part. So I want to end at that and invite Kwame to discuss the conclusion and the policy part, and political economy part.
All right. Okay. So thanks, Leo and Jacqueline. Thank you, Leo and Jacqueline. So we'll talk about, so we've seen the legal and institutional rationale for the existence of anti-money laundering laws, and also why we should use, why these laws should exist. And then we've talked about the enforcement, and enforcement therefore is a public good, because obviously when it is provided by government, laws exist, they determine the public order, or at least the order, right? And then Leo has taken us through, Jacqueline gave us a report card on the performance of the 11 indicators. Only 2 are moderately achieved. The others obviously are much poorer performance. And so if you look at that as a scorecard, it suggests that Kenya has quite some space to go. And based on that scorecard alone, there's merit in the fact that Kenya is in the grey list, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring it forward. And then Leo takes us back to an economic analysis, looking at the facts and giving us economic analysis, or rather a typology or a mechanism for understanding why, using the fact that because we're talking about anti-money laundering and IFFs, there's a clear financial incentive to for the person who would commit a crime, and therefore deterrence on the one side and deterrence on the one side and the prevention of that crime then depends on how law enforcement takes place. And we've determined that the laws do exist, so Kenya checks well in terms of the law and the fitness of those laws themselves to respond to this challenge. However, Leo then shows that basically on the existence of law, the enforcement across the value chain, so it's as if different things are required, suggests that the laws exist, but the enforcement is not up to date. So one of the things that we see here is basically it's suggesting to us that it's a political economy problem, money laundering, and IFF, of course, which is related to it. So the first thing you see is that government should have an interest in money laundering and fiscal, in general, and IFFs, because government of Kenya itself has undeniably large fiscal leakages. And those fiscal leakages do not just come from procurement, which is a bigger one, most effective one, with basically procurement of goods and procurement of services, but also the procurement of labor. Yesterday, a list, or rather, communication from the cabinet was released regarding the fact that in the last year in June, the cabinet secretary had declared that the government of Kenya would be migrating HR information management systems from an existing disarticulated and fragmented system into a new one. And that report shows that in that last year, as the implementation was going on, there was something like close to 4.7 million different amendments to records and transactions on the existing systems, conducted by 720 people. So those would probably be those who are authorized. That gives me a peculiar thing, because it's suggesting that on a day-to-day basis, something like 10,000, rather 20,000 different amendments are made in public systems. So even if you think that government entities, whatever number of government entities you take here, and obviously we're not dealing with all the schools. So if you talk about 4,000 or so of them, you're saying that each of them is amending records on a day-by-day basis of close to 5 or 6. Now, something about that number is peculiar, especially all that. But the fiscal leakages that government has, which have been estimated in many ways, some of those numbers are not very reliable. But on the whole, we have a problem with fiscal leakages. You'd think the government would have that interest. But you also see that the people who are leading the fiscal leakages are in one or the other arm of government. And therefore, perhaps that leads to obviously that problem being definitely resident in government systems itself. So it's basically a public sector problem. So that's the first thing. The second signal comes from the rise of soft crimes. And soft crimes are basically crimes that do not necessarily involve violence. And there's a very predictable, or rather palpable rise in the number of Kenyans, and we use Nigeria as an example, not necessarily, but you all know about people who lead not flamboyant lives. They're totally entitled to that, but advertise unapologetically that they commit certain crimes out there and in here using digital mechanisms and other mechanisms. And there are many of them flamboyant, all in the Kenyan media and the global media. So this would be circumstantial evidence that requires the government of Kenya, for instance, to respond to them. But often what tends to happen is we don't see those responses. And there are many of them, they're replete in all social media and even in the national newspapers. They're covered with very flamboyant lifestyles. They're entitled to their flamboyant lifestyles. But when they have the advertisement sometimes unapologetically of committing crimes, so suggesting that they're actually committing crimes and money laundering, you'd expect that the state would respond. So again, we're seeing those laws exist. It is not as if the law enforcement arms of government do not understand what these rules they require, but for some reason they hire some of them, of course, holding representative offices. But on the whole, the rise of soft crimes in Kenya suggests that yes, the sealing of those leakages and the enforcement arm of government is failing quite a bit in both visible and other less visible ways. So level of power application, I mean, formal and informal power application is also essential here. And one of the things that we've understood over time and that you see over time is every time, whether it's a politician or a Kenyan of one kind, it's usually very difficult to respond because you're not sure when law enforcement takes place, because anti-money laundering laws and fraud laws and anti-corruption laws in Kenya are weaponized politically. And the problem with that is then it loses public confidence when one person is being investigated or be brought before the law, or whether this is legitimate. In many cases, it's legitimate, but the application of the law is so varied and actually patchy that people argue whether it's for ethnic reasons, they argue whether it's for even sometimes gender reasons, that women or men are being attacked entirely for being women or being men when they're investigated for crimes that they have, I mean, that they're committed or that they're associated with. So the power application tends to be formal and informal, and we don't have evidence of consistent application of rules here. So again, what you see is that evidence of informal power application. And I think there's also a diversion of supervision and responsibility. So for instance, the questions of IFFs and money laundering laws in Kenya on its application and the outcomes are entirely made to look like it's a problem of accountants, lawyers, and a couple of other professionals. When we have, call it the Directorate of Criminal Investigation on one side, we have the ESCC, which is supposed to investigate crime and corruption in general, and we have the Financial Reporting Center. All these responsibilities exist in one place. But for some reason, we make it look like it's a legal problem, that it's lawyers who are hiding and trying to make lawyers, law officers, accountants, and other professionals who deal with individuals that might be politically exposed, or individuals that might have connections to crime or who have, connections to crime, make it look like it's the responsibility of those other professions to correct that. When the truth is, the tools and the law and the information for whether somebody is a suspect or not should be resident in the investigating bodies or in the enforcement bodies. So trying to shift that responsibility, in my view, is again a reflection of the fact that the seriousness on the execution of these laws that are being passed and which many people accept meet the benchmarks. It's just shifting. So that suggests once again that this is very anti-money laundering and IFF laws, and the rules or the outcome that we see Kenya scorecard reflects behavior within the public sector in Kenya, and very, very clearly. There's also tactical behavior of institutions. So if you look at the tactical behavior of institutions, I need to state, for instance, the Institute of Economic Affairs, of course, is a think tank. All our accounts are published on our website, and sometimes we receive small grants, and sometimes they're delayed by as much as a couple of days, even longer. And yet we have a history of several years of those same transactions. So what we think, in our view, is that the bankers and those who do these things, even while they know which are the most politically exposed or which people are the most exposed, but there's a tendency for people to look away and actually tick boxes by saying, but we asked the IEA, for instance, and it's very, very clear. Most of this problem resides in people with political power or who have offices in the arms of government. That's the biggest point. But I think the tactical behavior now is for institutions not to go for the real people who fit the criminal profiles of IFF leaders, and to go necessarily to the softer targets, individuals and people. And if you add that to the fact of informal and informal levels of power, it's very, very clear that everybody knows where the risks are, the largest risks are, but they want to make it look like they're working very hard. So if you look at Kenyan banks, many of whom have been, through central bank action, been reprimanded and in some cases fined, right? And they have these big accounts with money flowing from the public sector, for instance, and payments that might meet the suspicion threshold, but they prefer instead to go for individuals, asking individuals why you're spending this amount of money and what you're paying for, and asking for contracts. Fine, but it is surprising to me that you can ask small investigations when we know people in the Republic who walk around with tons of money, keeping millions of shillings all over the go, which definitely has been withdrawn from banks, and all that does not raise. So it's clear that because of political pressure or the institutional arrangements that are not working properly, the tactical behavior of institutions and people who bear responsibility is to look in the other direction, right? To actually refuse to see what they see, what is right before them. The sixth is the level of scrutiny. Now, proper anti-money law requires, or rather, enforcement. Remember, we are not talking about law. Enforcement of existing law requires that specific thresholds be established for flagging. And I'm sure they do exist. But it's not clear to us that the level of scrutiny is sufficient. Often because you see Kenyans once in a while, Kenyans in here, and you realize that they are in trouble in other jurisdictions out of the country, whether it's because they're carrying enormous sums of cash, which they're entitled to, if that is their money, but they flag systems in other places when in Kenya there's no evidence that they actually did that. So the level of scrutiny, again, suggests to us, so for instance, in a country such as this, I'm not too sure how many transactions take place in a day, but within that are sufficient transactions for, if I may call them the authorities or those who deal with the enforcement side, are able to flag or to build an information model that gives them patterns, which I'm sure they know, and to be able to flag on a day by day, whether it's randomly or not, to flag transactions. So the level of scrutiny worries because it's clear that the biggest ones are being missed. And sometimes when these things come whenever they come to the public attention, whether through press reports or investigations, you find that this is a transaction that was going on in many places for several years and all that. So it's telling you that something about the way the red flags work is not very efficient. And there's also government of Kenya agencies externalizing law enforcement action. They prefer that other jurisdictions deal with this. And often that means, of course, there's free riding on, say, American law, US law, British law, when the same people within the jurisdiction within Kenya are not held accountable. So, for instance, I think that the government of Kenya is in a place, is very well placed to actually deal with political, or rather, the money laundering and IFFs, because the government of Kenya is significantly embedded in the entire banking system. The government of Kenya owns not one, not two, several banks, and some of the largest, which handle some of the largest transactions as well. Very, very stable banks, all factors considered. So it is very highly difficult. Unlikely. The government of Kenya is also a very big one, which transacts some very complicated transactions of all sizes across the republic. So it's sufficient data and good systems that if it actually wanted to bring to an end or to reduce substantially IFFs by dealing just with the banks that are under its own control and supervision, it would do a much, much better job. And Kenya's ranking, obviously, flagging in that list would be something that would be solved very, very quickly. There are also distortions in the real market, right? And so one of the things that you should see is the ease of payments and solutions and financial inclusion. And one of the things that many people who work in the formal financial sector now know, especially small traders and medium-term businesses, which are always being attacked, asked for transaction advices, invoices, very basic invoices related to businesses that they've run for many years with clients and all that. And I think one of the things that's happening is in the absence of proper scrutiny and in the absence of designing a proper mechanism, and not just a proper mechanism, but basically one that works without bias, and making sure that business operations are not necessarily distorted. One of the things that's happening is I think there's a fear that the financial inclusion that Kenyans have achieved will actually be reversed because people will take transactions away, small transactions, even when they're well-meaning, away from the formal systems and the banking systems and actually begin to deal again in cash and into other forms of exchange. Not good for the economy and certainly not good for financial inclusion. But it is clear that the behavior of government in the name of stopping illicit financial flows is not working well. It's a leaky one. It's trying to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut in many cases. And obviously it's looking at those who then face the pressure to answer, often at the least likely to be engaging in that. And I think in many ways, when this is also weaponized together with tax collection, means that financial inclusion and especially the use of formal systems might suffer if it hasn't already. So the cost of enforcement is falling on the most compliant people, largely when those who, many of them are in the political economy, in decision-making arms of government, or as bureaucrats within the public sector themselves are able to hide or stay away from the proper enforcement that is required. So in our view, if you look at the political economy, it's clearly as government systems and government operations top problem. And I think if you look at what Leo has spoken about it, or rather, if you think about what Leo has spoken about previously, it's telling you that it is unlikely that the sums might be large on the political, on IFFs, but those who are driving most of those are probably occupy a small percentage of the entire financial system. And so it is a mechanism for enforcement requires very accurate investigation. And so far, the investigating bodies, the enforcement side, be it the judiciary and all that, have not shown that they're capable of providing that evidence or doing it consistently now to raise Kenya's, get Kenya out of the grey listing. So, as we conclude, it is clear to us that legislation is not a problem. It's the enforcement side. And therefore, Kenya's progress must come from greater the judiciary side, when the evidence is presented. Do we have sufficient judicial? And there's been training for judicial officers. But sometimes when you see rulings or judgments that are made, even when the evidence should have pointed differently, can suggest to us that, yes, it's not clear that the judiciary is doing its bit, to be honest, in this. And at the same time, most of the responsibility lies with the executive side. And the executive side, whether it's the political part of the executive, or whether it's the executive in terms of the execution, the investigative bodies, those who are supposed to conduct oversight bodies, the regulators, and all the others. That's where Kenya's failure is. And so we emphasize that it's an economic or political economy problem. And if you look at the ESCC, for instance, I think a rearguard action when cash or the crime has been committed is always going to be suboptimal. So alerting all these bodies, many of them have sufficient resources, some training as well, and Kenyans pay a huge tax burden to keep them in place. To be honest, the judiciary and the executive are the ones who should be at this peer. Who should be faced with the conversations about how to make sure that the IFF rules, laws that exist are properly implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. So thanks, Kwame and Leo. That brings us to the end of our presentation. Those are the references to the presentation we just made. And I think because Kwame has concluded it well by wrapping up the problem as a political economy problem and summarize our conclusions, I will not attempt to go back to it. So at this point, I'd like to welcome your contribution. We open this up to plenary. If you have any questions or comments, if you have any different thoughts on any of the issues that we've discussed here today, we'd like to hear them. I'd like you to raise your hand and I'll invite you to speak. So James Kinywa. James, please unmute yourself and let's hear your question.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. My name is James Kinywa from Transparency International Kenya. And just to commend you first and foremost for that candid presentation. However, I have a few views. I noted them down. I don't know where they have gone to. Okay, yeah, I got them. So I'll react mainly on your bit since that's where I found my reactions in. So you've mentioned that there are 21 recommendations that actually remain unmet. But however, from these recent statistics based on the quarterly reviews that happened between FRC and, the ESM lag, which is the FATF regional body. They state that out of the 21, 10 have actually been addressed and 11 are remaining as outstanding. So that means 47% compliance. In comparison to what you had stated, that 21, all of them remain unmet. Based on the immediate outcomes, outcome number 5, immediate outcome number 5, here it's a reaction and a question at the same time, based on the assessment methodology. On rating, this one is moderately achieved, because we don't have a fully public beneficial ownership register, and as well the verification mechanism remains weak, as you had mentioned. So if question is, if we cannot even have an independently verified and public register, how can we call this effective and say that the rating is moderate? So my question here is the rating really based on existence of a framework on paper, and we don't have any demonstration on accuracy, accessibility, enforcement, and all that? On outcome number 6, that is on financial intelligence, this is mainly just a reaction to add on what you've said. The rating here was low, and as we all know, that these actually reflect the structural weaknesses that we have based on lack of interagency coordinations, whereby you'll find, even when you watch the news every other day, these key institutions, the EACC, DCI, ODPP, ARA, actually operate in silos. They are fragmented. There is duplication of mandates, and what I may call actually sibling rivalry that actually undermines this effectiveness. So on this one, I think there's a lot that needs to be done, more so on the side of government, and even as CSOs, we advocate for, operationalization of probably a joint task force, to help these organizations get to organize themselves and work fully. On immediate outcome number 7, for sure, yes, we have had a lot of cases that have been withdrawn, and not only just withdrawn. Cases in Kenya take very, very long, and sometimes you just fail to understand. We have structures, we have systems, but why does that get to happen? And sometimes you get to find that enforcement happens selectively based on which political side you are leaning on. Right now, if you're singing two-term, you're and unless otherwise. And so we don't have any successful cases on corruption and anti-money laundering. But the only success I think that FRC has reported based on this immediate outcome is the case on Illicit D2, the D2 attack, on the one that's terrorism related, because there's already a conviction. The case was actually concluded, and the culprits were taken to jail. And as per last week, we have a list of 13 individuals that were sanctioned for terrorism financing. And sometimes I just can't fail to ask myself, there's a review meeting happening in April between FRC and the regional body ESM lag. And I just wonder, is this also just, ticking a box so that they go report they are doing ABCD regarding that? And the very last one, on outcome number 10, terrorism financing, the rating is low. Right now, I understand the Public Benefits Organization Regulatory Authority, PBROA, is working on a risk-based mechanism for supervision, and FRC is also taking part in the same. So I think past April, the status on this one may change. Those are my only reactions.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Yeah, thank you for that useful contribution. I see Leo is ready to react, but let me see if anyone else has a question. Anyone else would like to add to that? Or if you have any comments, additions? Yes, so Leo, you can go first, and then I'll respond as well.
Yes. So my understanding of your question, James, your reaction is on that basis is that it's the the immediate outcomes, the way they are tracked, is that if you look at one immediate outcome, so let me give, for example, an immediate outcome number, the one that you spoke about, beneficial ownership. So if you look at it has two action items, which is to designate an authority, provide appropriate capacity, skills, human resource to regulate legal requirements, including collecting and making available to accurate and up-to-date beneficial ownership in a timely manner. And this should include the establishment of an appropriate sanctions regime. And then the second question is remedial actions, proportionate to effective sanctions against breaches of compliance with basic and beneficial ownership transparency requirements for legal persons and arrangements consistent with Kenya's risk profile. And most partly addressed, it's been given a score of partly addressed. So they are not measuring one thing. This is the point that I want people to understand. They are not measuring one thing. It's not just the existence of the beneficial ownership register, which they already made those requirements for. It is that providing resources to the BRS, providing legal arrangements. It's also providing appropriate sanctions regime, and then other remedial actions to ensure that these risk assessments are done. So you are not doing one thing. It's not one specific question, and it's enforcement oriented. So that's my point that I wanted to make, and that also goes to the rest of the others. So it's not that. Yeah. So, for example, you've spoken about the one on terrorism financing, that some specific people already were already sanctioned. It's not one thing. They're saying you look at Kenya's risk exposure, and then vis-a-vis your enforcement action. If you look also at the another one that you mentioned about the public, the regulatory agency for public benefit organizations, that they are working on something. They are not looking at those. They want the legal questions addressed, but they also want to see a specific actions being undertaken. So, like, to demonstrate resources, statistics, increase investigation, tracing proceeds, and instrumentalities of crime and prosecutions, consistent with Kenya's profile. So that's the point. And I know Jackie respond, but that's the point. They are not looking at one specific thing. And we are making reference to that, the African Joint Group, the FATF progress report for Kenya that was done in May of last year. So it's not one specific thing. It's a myriad of many things. But now, with this specific outcome that they would like to see, because this is increased monitoring. Because at the grade list stage, you are under increased monitoring. Yes, Jackie.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Leo. So I'll agree fully with what he said. And so, yeah, you're basically stating that we have a beneficial ownership register, yes, that cannot be independently verified or accessed for validation. And so you're questioning whether that rating should be moderate. So as Leo has explained, it's basically to show that there are many considerations, as you very well know, that inform the outcome indicator measures. So it could be that the availability of that legislation by itself was weighted or is weighted, has a stronger weight as opposed to the effectiveness. And as we had mentioned earlier, this just basically goes to show that when it's when the categories are to do with the existence of laws or institutions, then we see Kenya performing a little better because of the mere existence of those. But we can question that structure or that approach to rating. But in terms of what applies at the moment, or the FATF approach to measuring the providing a rating for this category, then as we have said, it's just the different angles to, or the different indicators. So yes, we agree with you. It exists in law, not fully the utility or the effectiveness in basically the use of this register is questionable, but maybe the rating, as we have mentioned, is higher on the on that mere existence, and that being answering a few transparency questions. So I think, yeah, so basically that would be my response as well. The other outcomes that you responded to or you reacted to, I think you were basically just adding your insights. I know as Transparency International, you have some serious interests in this. And so thanks for being here. And we will observe, you've said that there is likely to be progress on the on outcome 9. So we'll observe that, and please also feel free to share whatever materials you might have access to with regards to this. Let me see if there's anything else that you've asked. So let me invite any other questions or comments at this point. Anyone else who has different views? So Julius says that from an accounting perspective and regulatory perspective, which practical skills or areas of knowledge are most important for students to focus on to effectively understand and help address the challenges of illicit financial flows in Kenya? I would also really appreciate any opportunities to be involved or to observe or contribute in practical ways to better learn and apply these concepts. So the main question is the areas of knowledge that are important. To understand the IFFs. All right. Anyone else? As we conclude, I'd like to give a final opportunity for anyone who'd like to ask a question before I ask our speakers to give their closing remarks. Anyone with a question? I'd not like to lock you out. Comments, additions? Okay. So I don't see any hands. So I think at this point, I'll just invite our speakers to respond to Julius and then make their closing remarks. So I'll start with you, Leo.
Yeah. So to Julia's question about the practical skills or areas of knowledge that are most important, I think the first thing is to just start reading the mutual evaluation reports, and the mutual evaluation reports are publicly available, and then looking at the other parts, so if you're an economist, a student who is an economist, you can look at you look at data. What does this mean for economic policy? What are specific nuances? So there is all manner of angles into this. So if you say, for example, if compliance burden is on the persons who are already compliant, this is lawful, Kenyans who are on the good side of the law. What does that mean for financial inclusion? And what does that mean for? So it's just reading those reports and asking different questions. If you are a law student, similar thing. Yes. So for me, in conclusion, is Kenya's approach to dealing with IFFs is a political economy problem. It was no doubt Kenya was going to end up in the grey list because first, our government is run, even our policy is formed. So, for example, like you're asking people, agencies, you externalize instead of law enforcement dealing with a problem. They know, like, for example, client X, who is probably a powerful minister or who is a celebrity in Kenya, is undertaking unlawful actions, and then to expect a lawyer, for example, to screen that person, or to expect when they buy an house, to expect it's the law enforcement to meet directly with that person. So there's an element of externalizing enforcement action to other agencies. So you want, instead of, so like one guy, so we are reading something, and Kwame could speak about this. We've been tracking this thing that if you Google Kenya now, if you Google the fake gold capital of fake gold capital, you will see Kenya in the first search. Many stories about Kenya in the first search. So you see one guy who had a case in 2012, 2014, 2015, and to today, 2025, they have all manner of cases. But you expect the lawyers, the people who sell houses to them, the banks to deal with that. That's a law enforcement problem. And that's a political economy problem. It's not something that a solution is going to come from, say, more policies, so say more risk-based strategies. Where Kenya is now, it's a problem of action, because that action is no longer there. A guy can scam people gold of fake smelting fake gold for 20 years. Nothing has been done. No action, confiscation action, no prosecution yield. All those judges who've been who've had cases before of the guy who keep postponing them have been promoted. So you can do all manner of policy work, be wonkish about it, but there's no solution, and that's the problem. That's the problem, and I think the bigger takeaway is that kind of enforcement is needed. This action of externalizing the problem has to stop, because there has to be an end to all these number of games. So that's the policy side, and that's what the biggest takeaway from the economic analysis that we've done, but also from the question about the political economy. So thank you so much. Looking forward to interacting on the same topic in the near future.
Thank you. Thanks, Leo. So before I close the session, I'd also like to invite Kwame to make some closing remarks.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think it's just the same thing, that it's a clear pattern in Kenya that whenever a big public issue is identified, laws are passed. And then when those laws are passed, that tends to happen efficiently, I think. Kenya's parliament is is a fertile ground for passing laws. And then when laws are passed, of course, then we have the problem of their enforcement. And my view is that Parliament needs to take its responsibility seriously, that it should not pass laws in vain. So it's not enough. And today, we've actually provided some defense for them by saying, look, the Parliament as a body has passed the laws. So the enforcement problems come from the judiciary side when the laws are presented. I mean, when the prosecution is happening, and the executive side, which is responsible for all manner of action. So it's a political economy problem. But I think in terms of the accountability, Parliament ought to come back and ask itself whether it's a good thing to pass laws that are not, and who's responsible for ensuring that they're enforced. And we know that in the next couple of weeks, perhaps months, the Financial Reporting Center in Kenya over the last long period has not had a director, and I think right now a new one is being recruited. When that happens, perhaps this is one of the things that Parliament should be asking. Instead of insisting on a HR assessment, which often could be done elsewhere, the Parliament should actually be asking about how the enforcement problems that exist and the FRC's own responsibilities can be strengthened when a new leader comes in, because in the end it lies with the leadership. So Parliament also needs to do something to ensure that its laws, all laws that it passes, are given effect. And if funding is the issue, whenever all these organizations are funded, Parliament needs to ask in terms of feedback accountability, blowback, accountability for all the money that we allocate, be it to the ESCC, be it to the FRC, all these bodies out here with very highly qualified Kenyans, most of them holding PhDs and all that. They need to do their job. And if they're scared of doing their job because this is very political, then perhaps that's the first thing they should let Parliament know, and they shouldn't take those jobs, because the problem here is enforcement. And some of these are really, really, well, it shouldn't matter. Somebody has consistently been associated with false gold and jewels exports from Kenya for years. Kenya is not a gold exporting country. Forgive me, the people from Ikolomani, because it hasn't started yet. And so we have an Inspector General of Police, we have a Department of Directorate of Criminal Investigation, and all these things, as Leo mentioned, if you enter in gold export, fake gold export capital of the world is Kenya. Now, they might not care for its reputation. I'm not one person who beats my chest and say we must all be patriotic. I don't know that that is a form of patriotic that's useful, but definitely organizations that have responsibility, have resources, need to do their job. And it's clear they're not. Whether it's collusion or not, I think it's very, very clear that Kenya is facing. And most of it is not just inability. It's very, very clear that the muscle and the nudge and the impetus to actually resolve these questions just does not exist. So the laws are passed for the purposes of ticking boxes. And I think that needs to end. And so we can't look elsewhere until we look squarely at both the executive and the judiciary, together with Parliament applying its required pressure for those other arms of government. It is. So this reflects to us that the effectiveness of IFF laws being, or policy being executed, is itself comes back squarely to how government works. And we all know that the effectiveness of the Kenyan government is very slow, especially when it comes to other issues that don't involve beating up its citizens. We need to ask government of Kenya to focus its life and focus its eyes more clearly on criminals, because we're all paying a price for it. Thanks.
All right. So thanks. So Julius, to respond to your question, in addition to what Leo said, a good starting point I would also recommend is obviously start by reading the reports. These are available. Elevate your knowledge on and Kenya's economic governance context, the public finance context. As we've shown here, IFFs intersect with different sectors. So there's just basically trying to understand the movement of those around the extractive industries, as my colleagues have mentioned, procurement systems, the regulatory framework around the different things we've mentioned, from banking, tax law, anti-corruption, and money laundering. So we'd recommend just quite a bit of reading, honestly, and not only understanding the laws that exist, but as we've shown, most importantly, the institutions that exist under those laws, and trying to figure out how those perform, the effectiveness of their performance, because that is what is lowering the ratings, as we have seen in our presentation today. Then regarding practical and engagement, or how you can contribute more, this is a good starting point. Just participating in public discourse around important questions like what we had today, so on public finance management, illicit financial flows, and so on. So participate in these policy forums, and you can also contribute to research, data analysis, development of policy briefs, even if you're not formally engaged by an institution, but contributing to that. And nowadays we have digital platforms where you can share, and increasingly then you will be able to contribute formally through the avenues of institutions such as IEA, other policy think tanks, other CSOs, and even the formal government institutions themselves. So I'd like to bring this meeting to a close. I'd like to thank my colleagues for preparing this presentation and also making the presentation. So thanks, Leo and Kwame. Thank you to all of you who have participated in this discussion. Thank you for being here for the entirety of this meeting and for the useful participation and contributions to the discussion. The IEA is a public policy think tank, and we are also a membership institution. So for those of you who would like to be members, please get in touch with our communications team and they will be able to assist. So Julius, you can also be an IEA member, and our comms team can advise on the benefits of being a member and how how you can contribute more actively as a member of the IEA. We have different categories for membership because I know the persons here represent different institutions. So individual membership, corporate membership, and students. So if, for instance, you are here and you think that this discussion today is useful for the organization you represent, also consider having the corporation where you belong or the organization where you belong, encourage them to be members as well. Then this presentation, Christine, you asked, will be available on IEA's website immediately after this meeting. Perhaps it's already uploaded, but the recording as well will also be available. Then, yes, I think that's it for today. Thanks again for being here. Please look out for other IEA webinars. I think there's one tomorrow as well. And also engage with us on our digital platforms to be updated on discussions such as this. We wish you a good afternoon and thank you, everyone.